There we go.
Thank you. Yes, yes. All right. So I begin the review this week with the two words synchronic and diachronic. As I was saying, these are Greek words, but they first appear in linguistic theory in terms of our English consciousness of them. Ferdinand de Saussure was the one who brought them in, and our use is similar to his, but not necessarily a close correspondence. Ours, and as in the biblical academic field. So synchronic and the chronos, they both have to do with time. Synchronic is where you take an overview. For instance, the New Testament view of is a synchronic study. It doesn't take into effect time beyond the broadest parameters of the New Testament. But if you want to do a study of Paul's view of and Peter's view of, for instance, you are looking at them over a specific span of time. And so these have been found to be helpful terms by its nature. Systematic theology is synchronic, and we noted that in connection with inspiration, God, Holy Spirit, prophets, scripture, and so on. And that is a very useful model for us to understand the concepts involved. Once we start to look at that over time, then we have become a diachronic study. And when we introduce the element of time, it lays it out horizontally. And so we have to go through from step by step. And the element of time has been key to our studies here today. Synchronic, diachronic. Synchronic, essentially vertical, without relationship to time. Diachronic, diachronos, through time. We look at it through time. So the standard invitation to Bible study when I was young was often something like, get hold of an English concordance and look at all the uses of the word faith, and then you'll understand faith. But there was no sensitivity that at different times, in different places, it had different meaning. And this has come to light in connection with more recent studies that I'll talk about shortly. The word pistis in Greek is faith, but in Hebrews, it's talking about faithfulness. And that is part of the aspect of the original Greek word. But without a sensitivity to that, when we try and bring the curt definition of faith in Hebrews to Paul, they don't mix. They are not compatible, though the same word is used. Second, models. Models. We have talked a lot about this, and we'll talk more today, but models are, and the expression can be another word added, teaching models. Models are a way of teaching, of conveying, building from the known to the unknown. Take what you know and compare it to something which has similar but different list of characteristics. Take what is in common, which will highlight what is not, and then on the other side, add what is different to get a pylon on the other side of the span of the bridge, or it can just be straight across. And an early model in the Christian church was the redemption or ransom model. I've mentioned other times, ransom and redeem are the same thing. To redeem is to buy back. And to put that in a modern setting, as we have done, this is the same as hostage taking. You take something of value, or more usually a person, a princess, for instance, that will fetch the highest price, and then you demand a ransom. And when finally the nations got together and said, we are not going to pay ransoms in our modern times, it has to a large extent dropped out of the news and hence out of our vocabulary. But that's what it is. And so this was the explanation of the Christ event that was dominant in much of the Christian church for the first 1,000 years. That is, God and the devil entered into a contract. The devil claimed humanity because on earth they had sinned and were thereby deemed to be following him and not God. And if God wanted them back, he had to pay a price. And so they bargained. And to cut it short, the agreement was the death of God's Son. So the process was set in motion in the incarnation. And the outcome was that God won. But inquiring minds wanted some detail in between. And the question on their mind was, how did God trick the devil? And the explanation came from fishing. The deity of Christ was the fishhook upon which the bait of his body was placed, and when the devil bit on the bait, he got caught on the hook. What? That was the explanation of the Christ event? And there was a lot said around it. I give you a part of it that is interesting. Not everybody said that, but there was this underlying concern until eventually it ceased to be the model. Only once in my whole life have I heard this preached because it wasn't a preacher. It was a children's story at a church I was attending with my father just before we left Australia. To this day, I am still shocked by what those children were told. It was seen not ultimately to be that helpful, but it's helpful for you to know that a centuries old, roughly a millennium old explanation of what Christ was about was seen to be not helpful and was simply laid aside. Now, we still talk about a redeemer, but most of us have no idea what a redeemer is, that money is involved. And you remember, in the book of Isaiah, God said that he was going to redeem Israel and redeem them by handing over various nations, including the Egyptians and Sabaeans and so on. But then Amos had criticized the nations round about and finally Israel and Judah for their failure to abide by the Geneva Accord, as it were, and they were handing over peoples. And there was other people who traded in people long before our slavery experience. But then we noted together in Isaiah 43, God revisited that redemption, that ransom model, and said, I'm going to redeem you, but not for price. The model has elements that you can relate to and I'm willing to use. But at its core, there will be no exchange, no ransom. And so we talk about a redeemer, and it has a warm meaning to it. It's biblical, it's helpful. We don't know what it's about. Now, we have looked in particular at Genesis 15 and verse 6 in both the Masoretic text, as we call it, on the Hebrew side, the Hebrew Bible, as translated into us for English in what we call the Old Testament, and then the later first translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the language that would become universal, in the time. And this is what would convey the truth. And in that step, the Judeo-Christian religion, long before there was a Christian part of it, bridged from east to west, long before Paul's time, and translated it in light of the now existing financial model, which easily merges into the legal model. As redemption was laid aside, so what began with Abraham, and then the Exodus and Sinai, which is the holiness model in the context of the sanctuary, that went for a long time and has long ago needed to be laid aside, because it was not giving the formula from beginning to end. There was a substantial, substantive change in the events of Christ. And this model was used by Paul when Abraham believed God, and the question is whether God counted him righteous, as the Septuagint made clear, or as the Hebrew says, Abraham believed God and counted God, him, as righteous. We've noted many times there are three pronouns in there. How you identify them determines two quite different outcomes. But at that time, without a model, without a bank on the corner at Beersheba, without credit, without the concept of credit. Again, we note the irony that in this verse, Genesis 15:6, the first time believe, righteous, count, occur, and occur together. The grist that would make the legal model was present, but yet lacked the human situation where it could be read in the direction of where the Septuagint later took it. Models exist to teach, not to confuse. And if the elements of the model no longer make sense, the model has no currency. And we need not spend our time trying to add meaning to it. Spend our time in the present with the eyes of God, as the Israelites did, seeing in the common events the presence and activity of God. The third one that I want to touch on is the Palmdale Conference. Some of you have alerted me to the fact that you have never heard of this, though you have been in this denomination all of your life, and it happened just up the road, Palmdale. Highway 14, I believe it is. I see that off the 5 as we head north or south, and it brings back memories of it to me. The Palmdale Conference was a culmination of a very active discussion in Australia. You may know that I have some connection there. In saying that, I feel like Peter. Peter said in his extreme Galilean accent, I'm no Galilean, the equivalent in Australia. God blimey, mate, I'm no Aussie. And he wondered why he was not believed. Palmdale. In the heart of the 70s and 1976, I believe it was, but it was before I came to America in 1978. And there was discussion about what is the core of the gospel when it comes to righteousness by faith. And this was in strong contention, so the General Conference got a group together, a sizable group. Let me put it another way, which is what I intend to say, a representative group. It was big enough and diverse enough to be representative, at least in those days. And they met for several days in good spirit. And then later it was reported in the, then I guess it was Adventist Review and Herald. Dr. Bill Johnson renamed it Adventist Review, or the board did. So in the Review and Herald, there are discussions by the editor and comments upon it. And the decision was that justification alone is the gospel, excluding any sanctification understood in the Wesleyan sense of any act on our behalf. And so that was the Palmdale Conference. It was an effort to nuance even more tightly the legal model. And so it stands as a marker. Now, I want you to take your Bibles. It'll be good for you to get up and move. So when you're back, I want you to turn to the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 20. Now, before you read anything, think for a moment. What is the first commandment? You know that. We all learned it. However, whatever sense all may cover. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Now let's look at the text. Exodus chapter 20. Then God spoke all these words. Now, that doesn't advance us very far, but these God is speaking. This is Sinai. Notice the opening words that he speaks. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Why don't we mention that? Then it says, you shall have no other gods before me. And in the New Revised, that is one sentence. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And I never realized the significance of this until I went to Hebrew Union College for my doctorate. And Hebrew Union College is the home of Reform Judaism. And I noticed that in the rabbinic writings, the 10 Commandments always begin, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It's in the indicative mood. The indicative mood does two things. It makes a statement and it asks a direct question. You say, what's an indirect question? Haven't you heard that today is the Sabbath? That's an indirect question. Would I be assuming too much if I were to ask indirect question? Direct question, what is today? And in the salvation process, in the getting right with God process, the indicative always precedes the imperative. If you put the imperative first, you end up working like hell to get to heaven. It's the wrong way round. Now, let me give you some more information because this is critical to where we're about to go. Jews, when they recite the 10 Commandments, begin, I am the Lord your God, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. They recognize, they hear that in that process of coming out of Egypt, they were saved, to use the salvation model. They were redeemed without a price. That this is when they entered into a relationship with God as a nation. It had very small beginnings. The faith upon which it would be built was almost non-existent. They'd come out of slavery, but they were no longer slaves. They could never be defined by that. They had been, but God doesn't describe them as those who had been slaves. The past is left in the past. We left it in Egypt. Or at least that was the opportunity. They took it with them. And the desire for leeks and all sorts of food that they were not getting. And Judaism is built at its core upon the recognition that they were redeemed. And they celebrate every year. In Passover, they picture themselves as being, as leaving Egypt. They prepare the Passover and the bitter herbs and that whole Passover service, and then they leave. They leave Egypt, literally in a symbolic fashion. Every Passover, you are in Egypt and you leave. It's living, it's real. And at the Passover, you set a place for Elijah, the prophecy of Malachi. Now, we have shown that we can be critical, very critical of Judaism. But at its core, it recognized regularly that it had been redeemed from Egypt. They were not working to get to heaven. They didn't need to. They were circumcised. They were the elect. And every year on Yom Kippur, it's not Yom Kippur, that's a fish. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. They attend the synagogue, participate in the service, and leave knowing that their sins have been forgiven for another year. There's no build-up. There is no future to fear the past for. That's the experience. And the foundation was laid at Sinai. And this brings us to the new view of Paul. New perspective on Paul. The new perspective. I said last week that I wasn't going to say anything about it, and then I was dissatisfied about that and decided that I needed to say some more for you. It still will be limited, but it will put what we have been saying in a context which I hope that you will be able to understand and to relate to in the fullness of what we have been covering. Dave made available to you a couple of weeks ago Christa Stendel's writing from 1963. He was a professor at Harvard, and he wrote on Paul and the introspective conscience of the West. And he demonstrated that what we typically teach in the legal model is through the eyes of Luther and not through the eyes of Paul. Luther did a magnificent work, but it was not without its flaws, and some were very serious. And the Lutheran Church in Europe, in Norway, for instance, faced this head on, and Luther's anti-Semitism. And the way that Luther presented Judaism, and in Judaism, the way Jews relate to their religion, in a manner that was not helpful. He had been part of a system. He had left it. He knew it all too well. And the major problem in what Luther did was to assume that what he had experienced in his time as a Catholic priest was representative of what had happened in the first century. Luther assumed that Luther knew that Catholic teaching had produced a works-based system. In the light of that, he falsely assumed that in the time of the New Testament, of Christ and Paul, Judaism was a works-based religion. It wasn't. It simply wasn't there. So E.P. Sanders came along and wrote a book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And he demonstrated clearly with documentary evidence that the Judaism of the time, which had its faults, but one of them was not an underlying works-based religion. If you are not following what I am saying, let me just say one word: Pharisaic. And now use the word Pharisee and Pharisaic in a sentence that is not negative, that is not pejorative. We have said so much based upon Augustine and his anthropology, that has come down through the years about Judaism, and that has sustained and nourished anti-Semitism that never was true. It simply never was there. We've seen how they understood Exodus 20. They knew that they had been redeemed. They celebrated it every year. They sat in Egypt. They ate and they dressed and left. Well, they dressed and ate and then left. They enact that at the Passover service, a powerful reminder. There was no risk that they would forget that their God had called them out of such a terrible situation. So, Jimmy Dunn, and I say that not because of my familiarity with him, but because of a website, well, a YouTube video that popped up on my phone. I had been looking for new perspectives of Paul, and Google knew that, and it kept looking for me and came up with a video of Scott McKnight. And it's part of a section out of a series, and somebody asks a question on the new perspectives of Paul, and Scott McKnight, who is very engaging, shocked me when he said, I was there. I was there when Jimmy Dunn gave the first lecture. Sounded like Manson or something like that, whatever it was. He said, I was in the audience when he gave it. I was a student at that university. I was taking classes from Dunn, and here was the new perspectives of the Apostle Paul. And E.P. Sanders was a friend, and I don't know whether he was on the same campus or just where he was, but he would come and give guest lecturers, and then the two of them, Dunn and Sanders, would sit there and discuss with the students and answer questions. And he was there when it all happened. Wow, what an experience. And thanks to Google, I believe, I got to hear him talk, and it was very good. And he explained what I have explained to you from my own experience, that is not the nature of Judaism. And he said, until you understand that and accept it, that Judaism was not a works-based religion, I have nothing to say to you. You have to understand that. And when you do, everything changes. Everything changes, and the everything is understanding Paul and his relationship, on the one hand, to Judaism, and on the other hand, to the Gentile church. When you go back, and when I go back to Romans, we find ourselves immersed in the legal model. It's inevitable. It's drilled into us. And so when you take that into consideration, and the new perspective implies an old perspective, and of course that is the case. There never was a new covenant, or the idea of a new covenant. There was never the idea of an old covenant until in Jeremiah 31, The prophet says, behold, I make a new covenant. A new covenant based upon Torah. You never hear that because the word is not it is the word Torah in Hebrew, law and particularly instruction. It doesn't change. The new covenant does not depend on a new set of laws, but a reapplication in a different context. And in case this seems remote to you, again, I remind you that that passage is the longest quotation in the New Testament, in the entire New Testament, and it's in the book of Hebrews, first in its entirety, 31 to 34, Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34, and then in chapter 10 in a summary review, based on the same laws. What's the difference? It's the change in the human heart. The human heart is not emotion. The human heart is not something that is just emotion. In those days, there was no awareness of the function of the brain and the location on the top of our head. That came much later than Old Testament and New Testament. And so they thought of mind and heart. But remember, in Proverbs says, as a man thinks in his heart, on the one hand, and being touched in our heart and the feelings, they're in the same place. And that's true, except now it's on top of our head. Now, if we had a meter on the front, and we could see the activity, we would know there was something going on inside there, but nobody thought to give us that indication. Or LEDs, it doesn't need to be a meter these days, or something flashes or something. There is some indication beyond a headache. And so the new covenant, which is still Torah, is written on the heart in the sense of not just head, intellect, or emotion, but the wholeness of the person. This is a whole person experience. So, these are elements of the new perspectives on health. Now, if it's not along the lines that Luther went, what was Paul talking about? Paul was talking about the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. How does a Gentile get into this new covenant? Where's the barrier? You see, Judaism was not a works-based religion. They didn't need merit because they were elect. They had been circumcised. Gentiles were excluded because they weren't circumcised. And Paul is seeking a way to bring this together. The distinctives, circumcision, health laws, Sabbath, kept the Jews apart. And they believed that the continuing in their state of being elect, they would go to heaven. Second, their sins were taken care of every day of atonement for that year. Rosh Hashanah, the new year, precedes by 10 days, I believe it is, Day of Atonement. You start the new year, here it is ready to receive the individuals who come into it and pause to have their sins forgiven. And this year is a tabula rasa. That's it. But Paul says there has to be a way for Gentiles to be able to enter in. And he addresses circumcision. Circumcision, he eventually says, is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But there is Christ, there is the unity there. And if we are Abraham's seed, if we believe, we are in Christ and we are Abraham's seed. That's the relationship. We have discussion about dietary foods and wonder why this comes up and what's all this about. These are the barriers that Paul was dealing with. So, what about the cross? What about the cross? The cross, evangelical religion tells us, is the one non-negotiable. This was the sacrifice that provided the atonement that made it possible for God to forgive us. This is the system that I was never able to accept. Many others have and have been blessed by it. I don't want to take that away from anybody, but I also know, because I have a pastor's heart, that there are many people who, like me, and maybe they are cursed with the same temperament. We melancholies, it's a hard life. And I remember one day, not so long ago, Eleanor showed me a card that she had received and was so expressive of the appreciation to her for what she had done. And when I read it, I said to her, that's exactly what I meant when I said thank you. That's how our temperament is so easily misunderstood. But many of you share my struggles and the willingness to forgive ourselves and to accept that we are accepted. Well, we accept that we are accepted, but we find it impossible at times to forgive ourselves. I don't have time to go further with that, but I was blessed with an experience which was really life-changing for me. So, as I have been doing this, studying in this series, sometimes early in the morning, I'm awake for an hour or two, pacing around the house. I actually enjoy it, except it robs me of sleep. But thinking this through, and I've come to see how all-pervasive the legal model is, including the cross. And if we remove the legal model, what possibly are we left with? I have come to accept that models are not always necessary, and that we are not required to believe any of the models. Models are given to be helpful, and if they're not, lay it aside. And if you can't approach to God, let go of that God, and God will find you. Now that brings me to what now enriches my life and gives me peace. If you go down to La Sierra campus, you will see down there, if you find the right place and it's prominent on the campus, the statue of the prodigal father. Prodigal because he was the one that was wasting resources, it seems, over the son. And you know the story, divided, but you may not have noticed that before the son left, he demanded that the inheritance be divided. This was unheard of. Inheritance is divided after death, and the father divided it and said, son, do what you have to. I'll see you later. I don't know whether he said it, but that's what he acted. He was not finished with the son. He gave him his space. And the son took the initiative and left. And the elder brother stayed at home. He had the other half of the inheritance. He never went anywhere. He stayed and worked. His was a righteous life. Where was the father? How come he happened to be out that day? To the extent that the outcome depended on the father, he went as far as he could and way beyond. I see him out there every day. Maybe this is the day. And he was not morose. He talked to people going by. Have you been so-and-so? Do you happen to know my son? Is he doing well? What's happening? No news, no news. And then one day, the son comes. And he rushes out to meet him. The son has prepared his legal speech. Dad, if I can just be home, I won't be in the house. I'll be with the servants, but just to be with you. And the father said, well, yeah, we'll need to quarantine for a time. I don't know. I can smell like you. It smells like you've been among the pigs. We'll have to sterilize everything and stay out of the living room. You can't sit on the furniture or anything. No preconditions. And amongst all the various models, Redeemer, Savior, Justify, Sanctify, legal model, holiness model, there is the family. And I know many people, many women have not grown up in a home where this is attractive. But I also know that almost everybody has seen a family that they would like to be part of. And it is that warmth and abundant love in the family relationship that the prodigal represents, and God promises us. God is love. Metaphor, it's a model, it's all of that. But we've experienced love limited, but wonderful, that brightens our lives and changes everything, and its absence is so destructive and brings out the worst and all the rest of it. At this stage in life, that's all I need. That's all you need. Theories of the atonement, where they bless, are helpful, and where they don't, they're not. I have no theory of the Christ event except that God is love, and Jesus told the parable of the prodigal son with no preconditions, no anything, instant acceptance. And the past is forgotten. The father doesn't have to put him through therapy. The son got to the point where he knew that the only available direction to go was home. And he went, and the father accepted him. And I haven't forgotten the cross. The cross. Jesus came down to earth. And in John's gospel in particular, to share the love of God. But in the synoptics as well. First commandment, love God. Next commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. And in the parable of the Good Samaritan, who was the neighbor? It was the black guy. There are no distinctions. That in 2020 would be Jesus' story. Whatever his actions may be that he did in the story that were comparable today to then, or a Latino, or a Muslim, or whatever it is. And the Lord's Prayer begins in the Latin, Pater Noster, in the Greek, Pater Haimon, our Father. Our Father, without limit, pure genius. You can't pray that without encompassing the whole world. But why did Jesus have to die? He didn't. And yet he did. He came as pure love. And this brought out the hatred. This is why those times seem so different and so troubling. It stirred everything to its core. Now, there are those who talk about this in a jesting manner. Why did Jesus die? It was the ultimate expression of the love of God. There were no legal games. There were no as-ifs. Jesus loved us all the way to death. And thankfully, and back. That's it. That's it. But unfortunately, I heard this characterized once as two men sitting on the shore of the ocean, and they're talking, and one says to the other, "Let me show you how much I love you." And he goes out into the ocean and drowns. Travesty. Outrageous. Women, you understand this. In that school shooting where a girl had been shot 3 times, moved to shield a fellow student who had not been shot. Unfortunately, the gunman saw it and riddled them with bullets. The mother bird in nature. The picture it, there's a raging waterfall, the branches are bending, and there is this small mother bird with the chicks under her wings, under his wings. Remember the hymn? That is all I have to offer. And that is all you need. God bless. Dave, back to you.
He's asleep.
Thank you very much, Bernard. We need to take a break, and during the break, ponder what you have said. You have said much that penetrates our lives.
Hey,
Yes,
Karen is the first one.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor, for your presentation today. I'm going to hope I don't get too emotional. I have been waiting to hear this presentation my entire Christian life. Remember, I was baptized for the first time at the age of 10. I remember before that, sitting in the pew and hearing legal model sermons, and as a child thinking, but God is only pretending why can't things just be okay? And I was excited about going to baptismal class because I thought I would get an explanation that would satisfy me. And of course, I didn't. I was excited about going to boarding academy because I thought finally my religion classes there would make things clear. Suffice it to say, my entire life, I've just been trapped in this puzzle of the unsatisfying legal model. And your courage and your research, your entire life experience, your willingness to come here and tell us that that is not the only approach to God has just been a salvation to me. And I'm so very, very grateful. And I better stop.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much. I'm confident that many are experiencing the same thing. To think that God can forgive us without having to kill anybody, isn't that a good thought? It's a wonderful thought. Who's next, Bronwyn?
Okay, I'm going to read the list so you know where you are. Rodney Corker, Jeff Kao, Jan Webb, Ed Turner, then Peter, Elma Capino, Bud, and then Rick Rice.
How about adding me at the end if you can?
Okay, Rodney Corker, you're up.
Bernard, thank you very much, particularly for the personalized manner that you spoke in today. And I also have to recognize Karen here in that beautiful personal testimony that she gave us. This is part of the real richness that I find in this Sabbath school, and I appreciate both of you very much. The first question really is more a curiosity. Do you celebrate any of the Hebrew or Judaic holy days or events, given the exposure and experience that you've got there? I just wondered if there's any that you find really attractive and meaningful to you. And the second one really is my question, and that is, I'm always alarmed by anti-Semitism, and I'm particularly at the moment alarmed by the increase in anti-Semitism and anti-Christianity. But when I have some Christian colleagues that, I won't call them friends, but colleagues, associates that simply and reflexive say, well, what are the basis of your disfavor and dislike for Jews? Well, the answer comes back, they killed Jesus. What is your best answer to someone who is anti-Semitic because they killed Jesus?
Bernard, we need you to unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Dave. I should have gotten ready earlier to deal with the questions, and if you could just remind me of the first question, and then I'll take it all from there.
Do you celebrate any Jewish or Hebrew holy days or events because of your association and long-term identification with their teachings?
How could I forget that? Thank you. There is more to the story, which is really less. The answer to your question is no. We only experienced one of the services, and that was Simchat Torah, the joy of the Torah, or Torah to give the Hebrew pronunciation, Simchat Torah. And it is a service that is held at the end of the reading of Deuteronomy. So every year they read the books of Moses through Genesis through Deuteronomy. And when they get to the end, they have this celebration. They hold up the Torah scroll. They dance around the synagogue in a chain, one behind the other, and just moving around. And it is, the kids loved it. We all loved it. I made a decision that early on, I made a decision, having come at 34, to get as much education as I could in as short as time as possible. When I left Andrews, one of the professors told me that if I prayed hard enough, I could have a doctorate in a year. I never prayed that prayer because the best you can do in a year is only a year's worth of education. But nevertheless, I steered a straight course down the middle, and I mentioned this in my in the interview with Dave the first week. So we didn't experience enough of it. Of course, perhaps if we hadn't been Adventists and there was a conflict over the Sabbath, I mean, about anywhere else you could go, there would be no conflict. And we were very active and contributed in the church and Sabbath school where we were during those days. And I also, I was invited to Pesach service, Passover, by my major professor. And then when he found I was vegetarian, I was uninvited. So I never did experience that, so that I had minimum exposure to it. It would have made a much more colorful life for all of us, but that's the way it was. Anti-Semitism. Who killed Christ? I remember years ago, when back in Australia, this question was raging, and I thought about it. I thought about it a great deal, and to the core of my being, I don't resonate with it. After all, Jesus himself said, I lay down my life and I take it up. I'm not in a position to plumb the depths of that, but in one sense, it was something that the circumstances pushed him to, but there was an agenda above and beyond that. For instance, stepping back from your direct question, the next question becomes, so was Judas the hapless character that was put on earth so he would be here to deny Jesus so that Jesus would be killed? And there's no end to it. And I don't spend time on that. I don't accept it. There are those who see it differently from me in terms of which model you step into. You step into the legal model, you have a whole different world. Getting back out of it is quite difficult. It seems to have an answer for everything. And the New Testament writers wrote to their times, wrote unwittingly in the light of the translation in the Septuagint of Genesis 15, and they were dealing with this legal system which they found. The sacrificial system was at the heart of their religion in Jerusalem there. The book of Deuteronomy had gone into effect, and sacrifice was centralized in Jerusalem and forbidden outside of there. Everybody was concerned and consumed in this at the time. Jesus told his disciples that he had many things to teach and many things to unlearn. I don't want to rob anybody of anything that I don't want to rob them of anything which has enriched their experience, which they are firmly committed to. And I certainly don't think of anybody in that category as of a poor benighted soul or anything like that. I'm simply, well, it's taken 8 weeks. It's not that simple, I suppose, but I am sharing with you ultimately my experience, and already it has been echoed, and I've been a pastor for many years. I know where this was. This was so frightening to me that I almost got in the closet to think about it. It was, I just couldn't encompass it. And as I have progressed, I have really been led by the Lord. My message is of such a kind that it's not to the masses, but I have ministered to the few who have felt themselves left out of, not left behind, but left out of, with an obstacle in front of them that they were unable to climb. Now, I've noticed over and over, if you come to Adventism later in life, your perspective is essentially fundamentally different from those who grew up in it. And so I am tinged with that as well. I am who I am. Thank you for both questions, Rodney. They were helpful.
Who's next, Bronwyn?
Jeff Ordana, followed by Jan McQuiston.
The Romans killed Jesus, right, Rodney? He was killed as an enemy of the state by the Roman Empire.
Thanks, Dave. That was good.
Just that I have some Catholic associates and friends, and several of them have mentioned to me in recent years that's why they don't like Jews. They killed our Jesus. They
Well,
go to the Romans, they go to the Jews.
Well, as a matter of fact, he was killed as though he were the king of the Jews by the Roman Empire.
Yes, that's right. Yep.
He was an enemy of the state.
Mm-hmm.
Donna?
Okay, I that has made me want to just say my one side point, which is a common epithet for Jews among some Catholics is Christ killers as a label for the group. Certainly something that I heard growing up in my New York Catholic background. I really want to echo what Karen said. I want to thank you, Bernard. In fact, I've already sent you a private email thanking you and more fully, because this issue has at different times in my life made me just want to throw the church away completely and say, this doesn't make sense. I can't sing, there is a fountain filled with blood, drawn from Emmanuel's veins, those kind of hymns, and it gives me chills and makes me want to walk out of the congregation over this issue. And I just wanted to point out a couple of things in favor, perhaps, of a legal model. Generally, it's the root of really the base of Anglo-American law, and our legal system completely separate. The problem comes when we apply it to religion and make it a theological root as well, I think, as the way in which it serves well in a secular setting. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is the anti-Semitism in the King James Bible. It seems to me that the translators of the people at that time, who are, of course, Luther's contemporaries as well, feed into this, and it was convenient. It was for a variety of reasons, a convenient attitude for them to adopt and to infuse the text with a kind of anti-Semitism. The Jews did this, the Jews did that, in the way that references are made throughout the text. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'd be interested in knowing what you think about that. Remember, I'm sorry. I've quoted before Shakespeare's line from Julius Caesar, the evil that men do lives after them. And I think the good is often interred with their bones. And I think that's some of what happened, unfortunately, with Luther's anti-Semitism that has permeated Western society. Anyway.
When I went to Hebrew in college, I think it's accurate to say I was essentially confronted by anti-Semitism. I had, within my sphere of influence growing up, I had not come, I was not aware of that outside of what I was taught in church. And that was often not helpful, but not intended to be that way. And like you with Shakespeare, I hate him for as a Jew, but more for that, simplicity brings down the rate of usage with us here in Venice. If I could catch him once upon the hip, I'd feed fat that ancient grudge I bear him. It has been horrendous for a very long time. And Luther found himself in that world, and the King James Version translators hid behind standard understanding of the text and so on. It is difficult. John has long been a concern, although a more realistic reading of it moves in quite a different directions. But when you're looking for it, you find it, and it's such a source of sadness for me. Now, going back to your comments about the legal model and law, let me venture to point out to you that it is based upon assumptions about a divine law that we know nothing about. We have no indication of such, and good reason to think that it never existed. Despite Harry Anderson's painting, you remember, the great judge is sitting there, and above him are the two tables of stone, and Jesus has his hand on whoever of us is up next. The trial is proceeding, but the assumption is that the standard is the 10 Commandments. But the legal model has made up elements which says that there's, in the divine law, this has to happen. And this is why it's so difficult. One of the important reasons why it's so difficult to hear such a suggestion about the legal model and the truthfulness of it. No model is the truth, but we have had the legal model with us presented as the absolute truth with no indication of any awareness that it is a model. It has to be, because we are human. We don't interface with the divine. This is what Jesus told Nicodemus. Nobody from earth has ascended to heaven to find what it's like, except the Son of Man who came down, and you're rejecting him. You cannot get beyond your models, and nor can we. And so that perspective as well, it has encased everything, and it is at the danger of losing everything that it's so easy to remain where we are, and that's not where I am anymore. And thank you too, Donna, for your kind words and for the questions.
Jan McQuiston, followed by Ed Turner. And Jan, you need to unmute.
I think I'll pass, thanks.
Okay. Ed Turner, and you need to unmute.
Yes, I just want to say to Dr. Taylor, thank you very much for your presentation. For me, it not only was refreshing, but reassuring, and I thank you.
Thank you so much.
Peter Chimperu, followed by Elma Capino.
Thank you very much, Bernard, for not only for today's presentation, but for the entire cycle. It was very challenging, very good. We appreciated very much the time you put into this. I like to make a short comment on Rodney's question, if I may, and then I have two questions for you. About the anti-Semitism, it's not something that appeared recently. It's something that started right from the beginning. And I just want to remind you that in the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine the Great, he even came up with a law that was prohibiting Jews killing other Jews that were becoming Christians. And the tension was very high. And throughout the centuries, this tension between Christians and Jews was very high. An interesting episode happened in 1948 when the State of Israel was recognized. Of course, for the Vatican was the problem to recognize the State of Israel came up immediately because Vatican has a lot of important places in Jerusalem, in the State of Israel. And the Pope, excuse me, the Pope of that time, if I remember correctly, was Pius the 12th. And his answer was, I will recognize the State of Israel if the state will recognize that they killed Jesus and they apologize for it. Of course, in this situation was not recognition. The Israeli government didn't agree to do that. And the recognition of the State of Israel came only in 1993 by John Paul II. And it took quite a while until Vatican recognized the State of Israel. This in regard to anti-Semitism, my comment. Now the questions, the first question, you mentioned that there are new perspectives in understanding Paul and in comparison with Martin Luther, that Martin Luther was making some mistakes about understanding the relationship between faith and works. And of course, this is a major problem. And recently, the Lutherans and the Catholics reached an agreement, and they put somehow together the importance of faith and work, and they kind of reached a reconciliation. My question is, can you comment on that? What do you think about this agreement in regard to relationship between faith and works? And my second question is, right now, I think the Jews are celebrating the Sukkot. Do you think that the holiday of Sukkot has any importance for, if you find any importance for the Adventist Church?
Peter, if you could just quickly summarize your question. There were a few key words that I didn't pick up, I'm sorry. And Sukkot in relationship to?
Well, the first question is, can you comment on the recent agreement signed between the Lutherans and the Catholics when they reached a reconciliation, putting the two together, faith and works, both of them considered important for our salvation? And the second question, if you find any importance of the holiday of Sukkot for the Adventist Church.
Yes, good. Thank you. I can't comment on detail, not because I was a party to the agreement or something and have any inside knowledge. It's quite the opposite. I'm outside of that, but I am aware that the Lutherans were open and honest and admitted the past and Luther and what their heritage had been. And the term that comes to mind is clean up. I wish I had another, a better term, but it has been conciliatory and addressing wrongs. But beyond that, I don't have knowledge of the nature of the agreement that was signed that you are referring to, and I regret that, but we all have our limitations, as you understand. Now, the second question, and this came up also in the chat there, can't necessarily catch them all, but I did see question that arises. I don't resonate with the continuation of Jewish festivals, nor do I have any criticism of those who do.
Yeah, he asked a question that the guy's answering.
I know that at Andrews, there are Jewish services held, and there are Jewish Adventists, and I expect others who attend that. So it is not something that I have resonated with. And in fact, I don't find helpful that the agenda for the future times are to be found in the literal application of the anti-typical. We as Adventists have worked the wrong way round. In Greek, the reality is the type and the anti-type is in the place of it, but we've reversed that. And so we work from the limitations of the human and say, you know, it has to be this way. And that when Jesus went to heaven, he went into, we used to say, into the holy place and then moved everything into the most holy place, a room with virtually no light and four walls. I mean, that's not what was intended. Now, in Exodus, you have Moses being shown the tavnit, the pattern. This was a set of blueprints, as it were, based upon the divine, but it's not possible to put the divine within human blueprints. And it served its purpose. And why all the sacrifices at the time? Because in the Old Testament, in those times, people offered sacrifices. And this is the way, this is what was thought to be necessary to be able to appease the God. And God took the risk of using the same sort of devices, you know, the death of an animal. It had to be painful to him, and I mean it that way. It had to be. This was a way to try and reach them, and it just grew and grew from there. And it had its negative, dark sides and all of that. But it did speak to them in terms that they understood. Then Jesus came and did away with that. And it's interesting. We mentioned Council of Jamnia, when the temple was destroyed and the headquarters of Judaism moved to Yavne or Jamnia, depending on the language. the sacrificial system in the whole of Judaism was replaced by prayer. That was a fundamental change. And that's why Judaism now is centered around prayer, but you may not know that it was the conscious replacement for the cessation of the sacrificial system. And Dave, if I can just say a word to Karen, I hadn't realized at the time that my mic was off, but my wife kindly let me know. And I'm sorry to give you a Hannah experience. The lips moved, but there was no sound. And I thank you for your heartfelt response. And though I was unaware of it, I don't know who, I only know the need exists for those whose experience will relate to mine and draw support from it. So again, thank you for your willingness to speak.
Karen is waving. Elma Capino, followed by Bud Racine.
Can you hear me? Am I?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good. This is just an observation in here. I've often wondered why there were more than one atonement theories. Until after practicing psychiatry for 30 years, I have come to the conclusion that each of those theories are right in their own context. For the past 30 years, I would sit with a patient and I would do a very good personal history from the time they're born, their childhood history, and all the way. And almost always, I can come up with an idea of what God means to them. Someone who has been traumatized will see God as a very harsh God. Mm-hmm. So after 30 years, I've decided that we can only experience God based on our life. And if someone says, I believe in the legal model, well, he experienced that. And so that's true. Someone who sees God in a different light will see it, and that too is also true. So after 30 years, I can sit back and feel comfortable that we can only describe God according to our life experience.
Yes, and you remind me when I was graduate student in upstate New York, in Cincinnati. And we were attending a satellite church from the Kettering Church. It was the Miamisburg congregation. And we had somebody turn up at church, a family turn up at church. And when he recounted his story, he said that he went for therapy, and the therapist, who wasn't an Adventist, told him, you need some law and order in your life. I suggest you go and join the Adventist church. So,
well, as a sidebar, Dr. Taylor, I enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much.
And thank you for your kind words.
Bud Racine.
We need you to unmute yourself, Bud.
Yeah. Unmute, Bud. We can't hear you, Bud.
Wait, he's working on it. There we go.
Thank you. I just want to thank you, Dr. Taylor, for your weeks of presentations that were profound. I was reminded of Dr. Maxwell stating at one point in time that if you can't explain the salvation story so that it makes sense to a 12-year-old, then you need to start over again. And your presentation has been profound from the standpoint of your academic linguistic ability. For sure, it undergirds the story, the history, the wonderful salvation story that you presented. And I think it was Tonstadt who first introduced me to the idea that Origen knew all about the great controversy and wrote about it. And of course, we know that John Milton did.
Mm.
And then Ellen White comes along and writes about the great controversy like no other. And Maxwell was able to put the condescension of Jesus Christ within the context of the great controversy, which made such good sense to me. The idea that Jesus came for the sole purpose of revealing the truth about the Father, which is so diabolically opposed to what Satan's claims were about him. It made such good sense. You've made such good sense, to the point where I have no interest whatsoever going back to the legal forensic model. I thank you.
Thank you, Bud. I appreciate your heart that has spoken and your gentle spirit and kindness.
I guess I forgot to mention Karen's testimony. It was so significant because it's so representative of so many of us. And bless your heart, Karen. Thank you.
Dr. Richard Rice had to leave, but I am going to read his question because I would like to know the answer to it too. Did the cross contribute anything to God's experience that wasn't there before?
Could I elaborate on that just a bit, Brahman and Bernard? The standard view is that, not the standard, a common view is that the cross satisfied God's wrath, and in that sense made a difference in the experience of God. Now, I think what Rick is asking, if we reject that, are we going to say the cross made no difference at all to the experience of God, or did it contribute to God's experience in some other way than satisfying God's wrath? I think that's the context of his question.
And that's a helpful clarification, Dave. I appreciate it. And I'm aware, of course, of Rick's interest in the openness of God being so human. I don't have the equipment to answer the question, except that at my core, I cannot accept that words like immutable and all those other words which confine God in such a narrow space. It's like a titular monarch with nobody to rule over. And I resonate with an openness that is willing to he created the human and to see the directions in which the human goes, and the such contrast, the heights and the depths, and to see it acted out. And some may wonder why Rick talks about the wrath of God, and people have said to me in this context, I never heard anything about that, but the word that is used in Romans means that. In the Latin, propitiation, propitiation means to appease an angry God, and the RSV, the Revised Standard Version, ahead of the New Revised, introduced expiation, and I'm not going any further with that, but I mentioned a contract I had to sign for the English Standard Version translation required that the word propitiation be the chosen word, and that expiation was totally unacceptable. These are the elements that go behind it, and how there are the shapings, but it is not difficult to read Romans as though there is, that it was to appease the wrath of God. And the legal model has all of these preconditions, which essentially in some way amount to that. I am reluctant to say no, though even in saying that I have gone beyond my limits. But I appreciate those for whom there is the interest and the ability to take us so much further down the line, even if ultimately it is still human. It opens us up to new ideas, and Rick has spent his life doing that, and I've long appreciated it.
Okay, David is next, followed by Danilo, then Gerald Whitehouse, then Eduardo.
And I'd like to put McKinley on the list. I'd like to come up last so I can make some announcements about the upcoming weeks as well. So let's move ahead.
Danilo? And you need to unmute.
Sorry. Okay. My mother was 2 years old when her mother was converted to the church. And my father was a teenager when his family was converted, in both cases through the labors of colporteurs in Yugoslavia. And so I've basically benefited from having been born in the church from the cradle, so to speak. But when I was young, during church intermission, I would always take the opportunity to run in the churchyard at top speed in whatever direction there was space to run into, you know. And I, to this day, remember how some people would wring my ear because I was being unruly because I was running on Sabbath to make matters worse. And on occasion, there would be the elderly matron who would wag her finger at me and tell me that Jesus is very sad because I'm running around. And I was thinking, but I'm running around because I'm happy. Why would Jesus be sad because I was happy? For a while there, I thought that Jesus was not a happy camper. You know, it struck me that we often get the image of God from one another, and complete, in mathematics, we call this the propagation of error. When any times you do any kind of mathematical operation, you also have to do the calculations of what happens to the error margins. That's called calculating the propagation of errors. But in our experiences, as we share with one another, we frequently have these propagations of error. And we pick up on the errors frequently more than on the actual signal. And that is unfortunate because it causes a lot of unnecessary suffering. And I so appreciated Dr. Cupino's testimony about his experience dealing with patients who see things from various perspectives. Since this is now my fourth country, I've had to deal with different ways of looking at things, including different languages, from communism to some form of socialism to whatever it is we're having here now. And it is not always easy to find your perspective and get your feet right. In fact, it seems that there are very few people who are able to think from various perspectives simultaneously, we tend to favor the perspective that we like. And sometimes that perspective is better, and other times it is not that good. But there is something that I've observed recently, and that is in some areas, perhaps more so in Europe than here, that there is this current of anti-Trinitarianism. And I was wondering whether a reason for that, particularly circulating in our Adventist circles these days, seems to be because of some of these re-emphasis of the legal point of view, where you have to have somebody who's in charge and somebody else who's subordinate. And you know, it almost reminds me of some fiction from Hollywood that seems to intone the same way. There can only be one at the top. You know, this is the kind of idea that we humans keep coming up with. And why is that? I mean, each one of us as individuals is actually a population of probably about 1 trillion cells and 10,000 times more bacteria. So it's like each one of us is a civilization. So why do we imagine that God has to be one person only, when he advises us, where 2 or 3 of you are gathered together, there I will also be? I mean, it strikes me that it is a little bit odd. We sometimes have hang-ups this way, it seems to me.
Yeah, and if you're going to have love, there has to be some sort of community. And but anyway, my situation was different from yours at church, in that yours was outside and mine was inside. Where I grew up in Melbourne, we had a church of about 100 members, and there was just a church, and there was no hall big enough to accommodate what was in the church in some other way. And so we had 2 services. We had Sabbath school, and then we had church. So, and there was no children's division when we first went there. My mother started that, and it took off from there. But in Sabbath school, there would be 6 classes, and they would all get going, and there was a cacophony of noise. There was no carpet on the floor except runners down the aisle and not much else. No drapes hanging and plaster wall. So it just bounced all around the place. And I sat there waiting for the swinging double doors at the entrance to open, with Jesus walking in with a whip in his hand, because we were desecrating the sanctuary. But then divine service came, and up the front it said, God is in his holy temple, let all the earth keep silence before him. And the standard of reverence was high. I didn't make any noise, but I was swinging my legs, and I was gently tapped, you know, not to do that. And of course, I'm a PK as well. So I had a lot of time to sit there and think, and I thought a lot about it. And eventually I concluded I had the right answer, because Jesus was never presented to me like he was to you. And I concluded that Jesus was young, because, you know, whenever he was on earth, he was young, and he was with his friends and disciples and so on. So he didn't mind. But God was so old, he couldn't stand the noise. And so I rationalized it and said, well, you know, that's what happens with young people, and I'll just, you know, try and be polite and do the right thing.
Gerald Whitehouse. And you need to unmute.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Bernard, for your presentations. I have missed a couple of them, but I've certainly appreciated what you've done. And just two or three, an observation and then a couple questions. I resonate with the statement of, I think it was Dr. Carpino mentioned, people that he has dealt with, they often resonate better with the legal model. I would hope, though, that as we see in history, God has always tried to move people. Yes, he's met people where they are and what they're capable of understanding, but he has always tried to move them to a better and more complete understanding. And I would hope that that would be our objective in relating to people who the healing model, in other words, of trying to move each of us. I would hope I would be open to moving to a more complete understanding as I study and interact more. Couple questions. One, kind of simple questions, but I suppose one of the things that has fed into our characterization of Jews as legalistic is all the laws that were created. And Bernard, if you could just comment a bit on the relationship of all those laws to your characterization of Jews as not being a works-based religion. All of those laws have kind of led us, I think, to, or reinforced anyway, our misconception of Jews as very legalistic. The second one is some of the colleagues that I have worked with through the years who are working in the Jewish arena with Messianic Judaism and so forth, have a difficult time with some of Ellen White's statements, feeling like she is not too gracious towards the Jews. Could you comment on that as well?
Gerald, thank you, and thank you for your kind words and for your questions. Yes, what drove Jews has also driven Adventism. Now, Jews had more time; they have more laws. But when you think of the stacks of rules and regulations the General Conference has adopted, the purpose of the Talmud was so that in every possible situation, there would be an answer ready that would guide the reader, and it would be read and remembered. And there were many rabbis who had memorized all the millions of words in the Talmud, millions of them. Not only so, they had instant recall and could pull up all of the anomalies in the Hebrew text where unusual forms were used. And this was the nature of Dikduk. You kept dealing with all of these issues. They believed that they were heading in the right way. It was not a matter of salvation. That's the key point. We're not a matter of salvation, but a matter of being a better Jew. The Jews want to know what is acceptable. We want to do the right thing. And I think that we have lost a lot by allowing the religious world to make quietism normative. That is, God takes you where you are and essentially leaves you where you are. Quietism says to Adam and Eve, Quietism presents it as, in essence, as God says to Adam and Eve, give it your best shot. And when they fail, God says, I didn't think you could. Now let me do it for you. And in the heavy emphasis on the family in the New Testament as well as the Old Testament, and Peter's growth in grace, the Adventism that I grew up in was not legalistic, but it was committed to make the most of the resources that we had. And the educational system was the outworking of the Adventist mentality in terms of understanding and learning and teaching and blessing the world. We don't seem to have that world anymore, and I, for one, miss it. But all of this, what leadership is doing and all of the rules and regulations is following along the same sort of way. It's too easy to brush it all aside as legalism. I don't experience that way. Legalism is something much more different from that. And I dealt with that many years ago. That's not my issue. In terms of Ellen White, I appreciate the question, but unfortunately, you have asked it of the wrong term. Ellen White indicated that if we had studied the Bible as we should, her writings would not be necessary. And I have taken that up seriously. I am deeply trained and blessed by the writings of Ellen White, but because of my interest in biblical text, I have sought to the best of my abilities to understand that text. And I'm on a different path to what she was on, but what she had to say had laid the foundations for me. And I regret that those foundations have been lost, and we have lost our vision and replaced it, allowed it to be replaced by evangelical Christianity as quietism. Now, there's another series, but thanks for the questions, Gerald.
Eduardo, followed by McKinley, and then David.
Dr. Taylor, correct me if I am wrong.
I'll try.
When people think about appeasing the wrath of God by the death of Christ, I think that they are thinking of the sinless person of Christ. He's paying the price. Tell me if this is the truth of the people that you know, because my thinking is that Christ took our sins. So he was sinner. He was full of sin as no being in the universe. So his death appeased the wrath of God because it's necessary. Death is necessary. And Christ was the sinner of all. I take this from Sister White writings, that Jesus was the guilty, the sinner. And my idea is that people think that Jesus was the innocent, not the guilty. What do you think?
Well, this is, I am no longer an expert on that model, although I'm certainly not unfamiliar with it, and it's not where my emphasis lies. There was a time, 19th century, for instance, when Ellen White did much of her work, and she wrote in that context. And there are those who appreciate it, who guide their lives by it, but others of us didn't find that helpful, and I've given my address to it. Certainly, I don't resonate with what you are saying, though, in fact, I don't accept the appeasement of God idea at all. God is love. I could say my God is love, but I don't think that would be helpful in the present context. But I know that you have found this helpful, and we tread different paths. I think both of the paths are not too far apart in some ways. Other times you go one side of the mountain, I go the other side. I'm not pretending I go straight over the mountain these days. I go round, but the path is forward, and we must leave room for the understanding of each other. And there is truth. I believe in that. But I'm human, finite, and limited. And so we meet together and we fellowship, and everybody brings something to it. Thanks for your question.
Dr. Taylor, can David say something? Because I'm thinking that David is one of them that think that the Christ that died on the cross was the innocent. And I think that the Christ that died on the cross was the guilty one.
Oh, okay, I'll think about that and see if I can make a swift comment toward the end. Thank you, Eduardo. I'll have to think about, I've not heard the question put quite that way, so I'm not sure. But let's hear from the others, and if I come up with something, I'll share it toward the end.
Okay, thank you.
McKinley is next, and then Terence Dunder also put his hand up, and then David. McKinley?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Brandon, and thank you, Dr. Taylor, again for your presentation. I wasn't planning to comment, but since I've been asked, here we go. Very quickly, since we're talking about models, I think I have come up with something that I'm calling the reconciliation model, or you might call it the love model. God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. And I think that model allows for grace, justification, standards, and accountability. I hesitate to share this other thought because Dr. Taylor, your closing was so powerful, which I think Karen responded to. But many times when I've heard and listened to the recounting of my fellow believers' experiences in the Adventist church, I've sort of wondered what were the genesis of these experiences, because mine was so different. I've always known my dear Jesus from childhood, and he continues to be my dear Jesus today. I was brought up in an Adventist family. My mother was a dean of an Adventist academy. And you know, the experience that I grew up in, the church that I attended for many years and through my adult years, were always one that showed a God of love, a God who cared, a God who was interested in people. And I've always known Jesus as my best friend. And so that's the other comment I have to share. Now, I also want to thank you and David, Dr. Taylor, especially because in the second or third week of your presentation, David sent out an email that sort of sent me on this literature search that led me to Dr. What's his name now? Weitzman's presentation. And I think reading that dissertation opens up a lot of new lines of research inquiry that if you had the time and were available to have a conversation about, I would like to have that conversation with you, perhaps offline. But there appears to be some compelling needs to be addressed to deal with some of the shortcomings that textual criticism identifies. And perhaps, after this class is over and your series is over, if it's possible to have a conversation with you, I'd like to follow up on that. But that's all I have to say. Thank you, David.
Thank you. We need to come to this question of higher, lower criticism. Lower criticism is textual criticism. Higher criticism is contextual criticism. So we need to look at that. We will, McKinley, and it's an important topic, and we need to see the strengths and weaknesses of those approaches.
Terence Dunder. And I think you might need to unmute. Terence?
I don't see him. He may have had to leave.
No, he's here and he's unmuted, but we can't hear him.
Oh.
No, I can see him. Terence, can you hear me?
I think he hears us, but he might be like me where I have two switches on my mic, so I have to unmute and I have to turn on my mic.
Yeah,
but
he's wearing
seems to,
a headpiece.
I think he's working on selecting the right microphone.
Okay, thank you, Monty.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. I kind of was raised in Adventism. I went through all the schools and so forth, and as I grew older, wow, what is that? I'm getting a long duration echo, it seems, but.
We're not hearing it though, Terence.
Okay, well, what I was going to ask is just to get to the point, and you're probably get to the idea that I'm probably a higher critic, because I take the position that we have to read the scripture in context. It cannot be read as a verse by verse proof text approach to theology as we've taken it. I've always wondered, or I've come to wonder whether we impose the word perfect on Adam and Eve. What was perfection for Adam and Eve? The only thing they were asked to do was to avoid a tree. Of course, we don't even know if that is not metaphorical of something. But the point is, by putting this perfection or perfect requirement on everyone that followed them, we lose the whole message of grace, the whole message of acceptance that God was trying to prove at the cross. I think that at the cross, it was not a payment to God. God didn't change at the cross. If he changed at the cross, then he's everything the Old Testament people perceived him to be, which is quite contrary to what Christ taught. So I'm wondering if anybody has ever taken the position that Adam and Eve's perfection was not what we put on them, but rather something that was going to begin an education process that was going to last through eternity.
Yeah, and perfection is something that comes into our knowledge as it's from Latin that the idea of perfection comes, but it doesn't mean what it has become. So first in Hebrew, you have the concept of wholeness, and wholeness, shalom, is related to shalom, peace. There is this cluster of ideas that relate together. The Greeks had no interest in perfection. It was too boring. For them, it was the golden mean. Not so bad that it hurt too much, not so good that it was boring. Down that middle path. And perfectus in Latin, which Jerome used, did not mean perfect. It was along the same lines. It became a psychological concept, which meant absence of error. And in the Greek, there was another word, the telos group, which was to reach the goal. And the goal of a child is to reach maturity, not to be sinless. But when the King James read that way and the English language changed its understanding of the word, this whole idea that now seems normative came into being. But that is not where Scripture resonates. And this is where context is so important. It was, what, in 1962, I think, that James Ra wrote The Semantics of Biblical Language. Half of the book was a criticism of a word about time and the difference, how it was understood in different languages, and James Barr debunked that. And then the second half, he debunked the whole Kittle Theological Dictionary of the New Testament because it was wrong-headed. And the academic world stopped and took a deep breath and said, oh, so context does determine meaning, and context in time and place and manner, the better we can understand this, the better it is. Previous person mentioned conciliation. I thought about that around the kitchen. I am attracted to that. In Australia, as part of the judicial system, there is the Court of Conciliation and Arbitration, which is seeking agreement, reconciling, bringing together, and otherwise having someone arbitrate between the two, and you can decide which approach you have, and the result is binding. But it's an offshoot of the legal model, and I have attempted to find the outer boundaries of that, and so hence my choice of the prodigal father, because of its absence of those sorts of immediate connections, and it ties into the family. Good to meet you. Thank you for your comments, and it's been a wonderful time. Dave.
Okay, really quickly, some comments that we better call it a day. Terrence, there's a fellow named Terrence Fretheim, Old Testament scholar, who's written on this issue of Adam and Eve's perfection, and he's thinking along the lines you are. So Terrence Fretheim, you might.
What was that name again?
Fretheim, F-R-E-T-H-E-I-M, Terrence, okay. Same as your name. He's a Lutheran. Boy, we're hitting the Lutherans today. So that's that. Real quickly, a couple anecdotes. I had a chance to meet Christopher Stendhal. He died in 2008, but I got a chance to meet with him. Roy Branson had been a student of him, and I think it was through Roy that I got to see him. But I told Dr. Stendhal, I said, you know, I have a son named Christer Larson, named after you, Christer. And he said, well, I hope that's not too much of a disadvantage to him over the course of his lifetime. So that was a fun thing. Another encounter, this past week, I heard from Jillian Ford on another matter. And I reviewed with her the story I've told you many times about the night I drove Dr. Ford and my father down the hill from Jack Provonch's house to Loma Linda. And I deliberately provoked them so that they would for once be on the same side. And I said, I did so by saying, Isn't the forensic theory of the atonement the worst idea that ever came to the human mind? And boy, that coalesced my dad and Des Ford, and they both pummeled me, you know, just as hard as they could. But and it was tough, but I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it because for once, my dad and Des Ford were on the same side. It really was a good experience. And I reminded her of that. She said, well, if I had been there, I would have pummeled you too. So, you know, we have fun with these things. Let's face it, a lot of people have been blessed by the legal model. A lot of people have been cursed by the legal model. Dr. Taylor says, don't get married to any model. They are secondary to the experience. And I want to thank Bernard for that. He has been a blessing to us both academically and experientially, both. And that's been a very good thing. We thank him. We also thank Rodney and Forrest for getting us going in this direction, and for Bronwyn and Monty as well, who have helped us coordinate these conversations. Next week, Matthew Corkman will be with us. He's a young fellow who just finished a degree at Yale, and he's going to England, I think to Birmingham, to finish his next degree. He's written a book called Reading the Bible, Saying No to God, reading the Bible faithfully. And so it has created some interest around the circle, non-Adventist circle. So we'll hear from him for 3 weeks. I haven't talked to Peter yet, but there's been an interest in hearing from Peter. So I'm hoping we can line Peter up after Matthew. And then we have, by the time we get into December, I hope we can hear from some people who represent causes that we could support in honor of Roy. We can all support these causes individually, but let's do something as a class as a way of honoring the legacy of Roy Branson. And we'll be able to hear, first of all, from Ed Turner on that. And so all these things need to be scheduled. Upcoming after that, we have Gary Chartier's book and so forth. One other thing is we've talked about doing a series, and I'd like to call it Adventisms and Postmodern Isms. The plural of Adventism and the plural of postmodernism. And we'll pick that up sometime after the first of the year. So we have a lot to do. Let's pause for prayer. Dear God, thank you for these wonderful weeks we've had. Thank you for Bernard. Thank you what he shared with us from his head and from his heart. In Christ's name, amen.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Rodney, thank you. It was good to meet you. And Forrest is not here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David and Bronwyn and the other assistant or support person. I'm not remembering his name.
Monty.
Monty, yes. Yes. Great job, everybody. God bless.
Thank you, McKinley.
Bye-bye. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
I hate to turn this off, but I think I have to.